Welcome to the Good and Basic Podcast, a long-form conversation about the videos and projects on our YouTube channel and why we do them. Today I'm in London with a special guest that we're interviewing, Dr. Patrick Curry. Dr. Patrick Curry, welcome onto our podcast.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here, and it would be a huge understatement to say that I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Great.
So without further ado, I think I'll introduce Dr. Curry a little bit, and then we'll jump into the ideas. So my entry point with Dr. Curry of becoming familiar with your work was in your scholarship of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is going to form the basis, let's say, of our conversation today. I think is we're going to start with some of Tolkien's philosophies, and from there work our way through probably metaphysics and ethics a little bit, sort of the metaphysical and ethical implications of his ideas about art and power, and then we'll probably end up with ecology. So our viewers might be wondering why we're talking about Tolkien today on the podcast and how a British author worked its way onto a channel that has to do with primitive technology and appropriate technology and that sort of thing. And, well, we're going to kind of unfold all that and see where it goes, I think. So do you mind briefly introducing us? I mentioned that, you have done a lot of work on Tolkien, and specifically some other things on your website. You mentioned some other interests you have. Do you mind describing those a little bit, some of those scholarly interests?
Yeah, my scholarly work started with the social history of astrology and then divination. Published an edited collection on divination a few years ago. And Tolkien was running alongside that, but never went away, and developed into a couple of books. And I've also written on the metaphysics of metaphor. I think metaphor is very important and interesting. And most recently, ecology. So I published a textbook in around 2000 on Ecological Ethics, which has gone into a couple of editions. So the challenge for me somewhere along the line was to figure out what the heck is holding all this together, because it seems pretty eclectic.
Yeah.
And I realized that it's something like I'm trying to work outside modernity. Obviously, I live in modernity, but I'm trying to work against it by looking at ways of life that are non-modern, not necessarily anti-modern, but definitely non-modern. So that would be the divination, the enchantment, the ecology, in my understanding of ecology, which is a kind of not precisely scientific understanding.
And you've hopefully we'll get to this a little bit later, but you've mentioned that you prefer the term ecology to environmentalism.
Yeah, I do. The word environment is kind of already concedes a lot of ground to our opponents who don't really have the well-being of the natural world at heart, because environment means that which surrounds, and its only interest is as a setting or a surrounding for the main act, which is us, human beings, and that very attitude is a big part of the problem that we have now. So I much prefer ecology with its emphasis on relationships.
Yeah, okay, yes, and so sort of the thread undergirding all of these, you had all these divergent interests. Tolkien, astrology, ecology, and metaphor. And sort of the thread undergirding all of these ended up being something like that which modernity has lost or ignored or neglected or corroded, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. All right, wonderful. We're going to go ahead and jump in with Tolkien, I think. So a little bit about my background on this. So I'm a longtime fan of Tolkien. Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, some other assorted bits and pieces from his legendarium, letters and so on and so forth, right? And one thing that I noticed as I was reading through these books is that he has a very picky way of describing magic, right? He's very picky about those terms, and draws a contrast between the art, between the quote unquote magic that the elves use and the magic that Sauron uses, that the enemy uses. Would you mind sort of explicating that difference as you perceive it? That
Sure.
Sort of that whole what those two kinds of magic are and so forth.
Yeah. In his essay on fairy stories, which was Tolkien's kind of mission statement before he wrote The Lord of the Rings, he makes a very sharp distinction between magic and enchantment. And basically what that distinction boils down to is that enchantment is all about wonder, about being in a state of wonder. And it's always, if you go into it, you realize that it's always wonder at someone or something else. So it's relational.
Yeah. It has to have a subject and an object.
Well, and the object is always another subject.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter whether it's a human person or an animal or a tree or a rock or a forest or a piece of music or some food even. There's something, it's not passive. The other is not an object, but you're in a relationship with that other, and you are in full of wonder at them. Okay, magic is always power. It's will. If enchantment is about wonder, magic is about will, and that will is not relational because it's always power over the other, which objectifies the other, so that you can manipulate and do whatever you exploit, do whatever you want to that other, precisely because they're not a subject. And so you're not in a relationship with them. Therefore, there are no ethical issues.
They're wholly expendable or wholly wholly dispensable.
That's
perhaps.
right. Yeah. And so this is a little, in a way, too sharp because enchantment and will are entangled in practice.
Yeah.
So an artist, for example, will work very hard using their will, their skill, their knowledge to set up the conditions for enchantment to happen.
Okay.
Because we can't control enchantment.
Yeah.
If you're controlling it, it's something else.
It's magic.
Well, it's what I call glamour.
Oh, okay.
Glamour can be manipulated, and it looks like magic and feels like magic, but it has the same like enchantment. It has the same relationship to real enchantment that fast food does to a good meal. So the magic, Tolkien pointed out something very interesting, which was that the Indo-European root of the word magic is exactly the same as root for the word machine. So magic and machines have an elective affinity, have an inner affinity. And it's all about accomplishing your will.
So this is something that I believe C.S. Lewis also said and sympathized with. If I'm remembering correctly, there's a place where C.S. Lewis talks about how the European magical arts, alchemy and so forth, were actually very, let's say, spiritually or psychologically similar to science, in that you're trying to exert your will outwards and find the mechanisms by which you can control the external world.
Yeah.
So that science ends up working, and so we keep it, and magic ends up not working, not being functional, so we put it aside. But that the two are attuned; they're mutually attuned in their aims.
Well, not only that, they're very closely connected historically. If you look at the history of science, a lot of magic, the idea of the magus, as in say Pico della Mirandola's idea of the always male magus at the center of a field of energies, controlling, manipulating, went straight into Francis Bacon's thought. Very, very influential in Baconian science. So they kept the idea of the powerful male figure manipulating energies that are not understood by the ignorant. And of course, that went straight into science.
Which is a very odd thing, because I think most people today, certainly those that I would term, let's say, those believers in naive scientism, would draw a sharp distinction between magic and science, right?
They would.
But what Tolkien and Lewis probably too will say is something more like that. Well, no, science is just magic that we've managed to get to work. They're actually companion arts. They're similarly spiritually perilous.
Yeah, that's right. And there's also the observation by Arthur C. Clarke that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
And for the most people, essentially flicking an electric light switch, is magic. They don't understand how it works.
Yeah, this is a point that I like making about refrigerators, right? Like, I use a refrigerator. I don't know how a refrigerator works.
That's right.
As far as I'm concerned, it's magic.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so Tolkien is creating this map, and he says, well, so he talks about magic, and for him, magic is always a bad thing, right? Sauron is the lord of magic and machines.
Okay, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
Because Gandalf practices magic, doesn't he?
Well, but my understanding is Tolkien won't call that magic. He'll call it something else.
He distinguished within magic between, I think it's, I forget the exact terms. One is Goetia and the other is
Magia and Goetia.
Yeah. And basically he allowed some forms of magic to be morally good or morally okay.
Yeah.
And basically what those forms are is if you're using magic unambiguously to help people.
Okay.
Secondly, if the magic is itself relational, so you find old forms of earth magic in healing, for example. I'm not saying treating medically necessarily, but healing and working with the soil, working with the land to grow food. Okay. You're working cooperatively. You're not imposing your will purely, because if you did that, it wouldn't work. So it's a little bit, as I said, he oversimplified the distinction. In practice, we've got to be a bit more flexible about it.
So that is something that I want to hit on well, actually, let's go ahead and do that now. So something very interesting is that Tolkien, I'm thinking of a particular moment in Fellowship of the Ring when the Fellowship is leaving Lothlorien.
Right.
And the hobbits ask the elves, well, they're asking about the elven cloaks, and they ask, well, are the cloaks magic?
That's right, yeah.
And the elves say, well, we're not sure what you mean.
Yeah, that's right.
They were made by the elves, if that's what you mean.
Yeah.
And then the elves describe how the hobbits seem to use the same word to describe the devices of the enemy and also the arts of the elves.
And that's what Tolkien says somewhere, I think it's in the essay on fairy stories, that people use the word magic in these two very different ways.
Yes. And
how was the concert last night? It was magic. That means it was enchantment. Yeah. Right? But how did he make her do that? He used magic. I mean, that's magic. Yeah,
manipulation.
That's
in
right.
That sense,
that's right. So he was making fun of us, really.
So in my mind, this is kind of one of the really interesting questions here that I'm hoping to tease out a little bit is, okay, so if the same word is used for both, how can you stretch them apart and tell the difference precisely? Because even inside Lord of the Rings, these characters have a hard time telling the difference. Yeah. Insofar as, like, even the morality of the three rings is ambiguous, right? The morality of the three elven rings.
Isn't that interesting?
Where, they seem to be good things, but there also does seem to be a barb at the tail.
Well, the barb is that they when the one ring is destroyed, the three rings also have to go. Yeah. Which is an extraordinary point, because the three rings are all about healing and protecting and so all those good things. Yeah. And I think that comes back to a point that Verlin Flieger made, which is very valid, that it's all about letting go, even of the good stuff.
That perhaps one form of Sauron's domination, or one form of this evil magic, would be to hold on too long. That would be a form of controlling or dominating.
I mean, a thought that just occurs to me now is, at the heart of Sauron's project, somewhere there's a perfectly normal, understandable, fallible human attitude, which is to want to hang on to the good stuff as long as possible. And then that develops into, well, why should I have to die?
Which is that is a central theme for Tolkien.
It's a central theme, and if you remember,
I'm trying to remember, isn't there a statement where Tolkien says that all of his legendarium is basically concerned with
death and deathlessness? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Which we see it in the fact that the Ring Wraiths, they're not dead, but they're not living either. They're
for
undead.
Me, the Ring Wraiths are a beautiful example of what Tolkien called applicability. Yeah. So he said, I don't like allegory. Allegory is where, everything has only one possible meaning. So the ring of power is nuclear energy, and Frodo is Christ, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So I'm not doing that, because that's not good storytelling. Yeah. Good storytelling is where you find the meanings in the story that are relevant to your life, right? And that's what he's called applicability, and defended the reader's right to applicability. Yeah. Ring Wraiths are a beautiful example. Essentially, what are the Ring Wraiths but transhumanist cyborgs? How did the Ring Wraiths get ensnared? They were ensnared by Sauron saying, if you wear these rings, you will live forever. You don't need to die.
And you need never give anything up. You need never be
That's
incomplete.
right.
You need never fail.
And instead what happens is what Tolkien called serial living, which is, he said, we confuse that with immortality, but it's not. True immortality, if it exists at all, is on the other side of the grave.
Yes.
But serial living, what happens is this horrible thing happens to you. I can't believe that these, I know Silicon Valley people are a little strange, but I mean, this is really totally wacky. They apparently want to end up in a state where they are terrified of dying, but they long to die. Because that's what happens to you if you're wearing one of the 9 rings. It started to happen to Bilbo.
Yeah.
Right?
Like butter scraped over too much
Too
bread.
much toast, that's right.
Yeah.
And you're terrified, but you really want to die. I mean, what kind of an ideal is that? And the Ring Wraiths capture that perfectly, even though Tolkien, so there was no Silicon Valley when he was writing. Transhumanism hadn't been thought of yet. So it's a measure of the extraordinary richness of his work, that it goes on connecting with new meanings, and will do so indefinitely.
Well, and I'd be curious about a follow-up question on that. So, and it is, so this death and deathlessness issue in Tolkien's works.
Right.
Applicable to transhumanism today and towards becoming a transhuman cyborg, right? I'm curious if you see that sort of temptation for immortality operating in other places in modern life. That transhumanism. Being a transhuman cyborg is a dramatic example.
Absolutely.
And so I'm kind of curious about where do you think that we run into that problem in daily life, and if so, how?
Well, a much more general version of the same ideology is the rejection of limits. So I see a lot of advertisements on the subway and just on TV and so on. A life without limits. Well, what is death but the ultimate limit?
Yeah.
So this mad idea that you can live without limits, we are biological organisms. We are, in fact, beyond that, we are beings. Every being, to have an identity as a being, means that there's some things that it's not. You can't be, there's no such thing as a universal being.
You can't be a thing unless you're also not other things.
That's right, that's right. So so limits are built in. In fact, without limits, you can't do anything. Without the resistance of the clay, how can you make a pot? You're working with the resistance, right? If you get rid of the resistance as a limit, if you just get rid of all limits, you have nothing.
This is the bird in space analogy.
I don't know that.
It's a sculpture by Brancusi it's a beautiful sculpture where there's a rising blob that's connected by this very thin point. And it's like it's trying to lift off the ground, but if that one point connecting it to the earth was gone, the whole thing collapses.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. That's right.
I'm thinking also of the G.K. Chesterton quote, something like he says, don't try to liberate a camel from its 2 humps, because in doing so you'll liberate it from being a camel.
Exactly.
Don't go around telling triangles to get rid of their 3 sides, because if they remove that limitation, they're not a triangle anymore.
And I think that idea about that limits are necessarily a bad thing, or that you could do without them. Looking at that a little more closely, it's extremely anthropocentric. Supposedly we're the only animal that gets to do this. And it's it's incredibly narcissistic, because it's, again, all about me. I think it's quite a destructive idea and a complete illusion.
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Kurt Gödel.
I'm not. Oh, Gödel, the mathematician.
Yeah, the mathematician.
Of course, yeah.
So this is something that both of us are quite interested in, that seems to bear on this, right? Gödel's theorem that proclaims that these systems of arithmetic they can be consistent.
Right.
They can be complete. They can never be both.
Right.
And that seems to be a similar thing, right? That perhaps that longing for immortality, at least that wrong kind of immortality that is Tolkien, serial living, right?
Serial living.
Is that desire to be wholly self-contained.
And wholly secure.
And wholly secure.
And therefore invulnerable.
The idea that I know and am all that I need to know and be.
That's right. It's control, and therefore I'll be safe.
And it seems like one of the consequences of that is total impermeability, right? You can't let anything come in, you can't let anything go out, because you can't even admit that there's anything out there, because if there was something out there that's beyond you, then, it'd be beyond you.
It's a truly psychotic state.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, I think, I think that's exactly right. Let's see, so going back to these advertisements, right? So all these ways in which we desire to be limitless is where you're seeing.
Or another way it's framed as to be free of limitation, of constraints. We do anything we want.
And your reply would be something like, well, we perhaps want to be free of some things, but we don't want to be free of all things, because to be free of all things would be to be nothing at all.
Well, that's right.
There are some things we actually do want to be tied down and constrained by.
That's right.
Or
it's part of
phrase it differently.
It's part of the package.
Yeah.
Inextricably.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is a fantastically anti-ecological attitude as well. In my quest for freedom, I get to use whatever resources I need, turns everything, nature, into resources. You can't have a relationship with a set of resources, but you can with living nature, which is what Tolkien's nature is in Middle-earth.
A nature that perhaps pushes back a little bit, or pushes
Sometimes
back is
more than a little.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking of the Ents particularly.
Sure. Nobody's precisely on my side. I'm not on anybody's side, because nobody's precisely on mine.
Yeah. It was funny, we visited Tintern Abbey, not yesterday, but the day before, and we stopped by the side of the road just to walk through the Welsh woods a bit. And both of us kind of got the feeling that the woods didn't really want us to be there that much.
Right, yeah. Well, like the Old Forest did
the Old Forest in Lord of the Rings. It was kind of interesting. Right. Well, and this brings up another interesting thing, right? And this is, I guess, metaphysically fraught territory, right? So when we start talking about things pushing back on us, right? And the Old Forest in Lord of the Rings, and perhaps even these Welsh woods here, and objects being subjects, that being the proper way to think about them. Yeah. That starts us thinking down the road of, okay, so all these so-called objects around us, right? The roughly inanimate and material objects around us. Yeah. How should we think of them as being sentient? In that, and if you don't mind me just mentioning one example from Tolkien is that keeps coming back to me is in Moria, when Gandalf and the Balrog are facing off against each other, and the sentences go, "A red sword leapt flaming from the darkness. Glamdring glittered white in answer." I just think that's so striking, because the swords are the agents there. The red sword leaps.
Good point.
Glamdring glitters.
Oh, good point. I never noticed that.
It's Gandalf. Gandalf and the Balrog are there too. But in those two sentences,
we can add that to a long list of those kinds of things happening in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
When Caradhras doesn't want the company to cross, he himself, the mountain, let me gender it for a moment, sends down just enough snow to stop them. Or when Aragorn crumbles Athelas in hot water, the air sparkles with joy. Now, he doesn't say it was as if the air sparkled with joy. The air sparkles. Or it was like the air was. The air sparkled with joy, man. Which is a non-modern perception. Yes. Good modernists police themselves to say, oh no, I felt like the air was, but it couldn't, that's impossible. We know that's impossible. So it must have been, it was as if, and they engage in this ridiculous self-policing all the time. Tolkien doesn't bother, and we don't need to bother either. But to come back to your question, how should we regard these?
How should we think about this?
Well, philosophically, the idea that everything is, to some degree or another, sentient, in other words, an agent or a subject, right, is panpsychism. I'm completely neutral on that. I'm certainly not prepared to rule it out. And in fact, a recent philosopher I was reading, Galen Strawson, just about convinced me that it can't be ruled out, that it is certainly possible. Okay. Part of his argument is, quote, "It's not that we don't really understand matter, it's that we really don't understand matter." So that possibility can't be ruled out. However, what interests me more, at least to date, is animism, which is basically a practice or a way of life, of going through life, remaining open to sentience or agency or subjecthood, and therefore relationship, wherever you encounter it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying, everything is alive, whether we know it or not, because for me that comes uncomfortably close to a sort of monotheistic dogma.
Mm-hmm.
There is only one God, whether you know it or not, and whether you like it or not. I don't want to go down there.
Mm-hmm.
But I am in favor of remaining open to the possibility of, most of the time these rocks don't have anything to tell me.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe
every
today, this afternoon at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and et cetera, the more precise you get, the more likely it is to be real.
Uh-huh.
This rock is trying to tell me something. I want to be open to that.
Yeah.
And that borders on what I call practical divination.
Okay.
You don't need the I Ching or astrology or tarot cards to do that. That's how you live.
Mm-hmm. Is
open to those messages.
Reading and listening to the environment.
That's right, exactly.
Well, so first of all, I'm really interested I'm really interested and maybe even pleased that you said that, because as I was kind of wrestling through that issue in my mind, I thought, well, I don't know if I want to commit myself to the position that all of these ostensibly immaterial objects, I don't want to commit myself to the position that they have a spirit in the sense that I normally think about spirits.
No.
But I definitely, and I think most people, if they would reflect a little, would probably come to the conclusion that yes, I do sometimes feel like the supposedly immaterial objects around me have poked me a little in some way.
Yeah, because we confuse the technical definition of alive, which is a biological, scientific definition, with the sort of existential definition, which is quite different. Do you know the famous story about Irvin Halliwell, the anthropologist?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, it's a great story.
Go right ahead,
It's quite well known among some anthropologists. Irving Halliwell was an English anthropologist working with the Ojibwe in northern Manitoba, and he was talking to an old Ojibwe man on the Barren River, lots of stones, lots of rocks, and he knew that in Ojibwe, rock means, or stone is technically alive, in that language. So he said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, probably with a touch of exasperation to the old man, do you mean to tell me that all these rocks are alive? And he said, the old man thought for a while, and then he said, no, only some of them. And what happened there was that the old man gave the best answer he could to a really idiotic question. Because if you say, yes, these rocks are all alive, then somebody's going to say, they don't look alive to me, right? At the moment, not much happening here. Yeah. But if you say no, then you're foreclosing the possibility that one of them or more could come alive in your experience. So he came up with some of them.
I couldn't help but think that that's a response that I might consider giving about people too.
Well, yeah,
absolutely. Some of them do seem to be a little bit more alive than others. So.
Very good point.
I think that's also really interesting because, I guess when we think about assigning sentience to immaterial objects, kind of the place that we first leap to is, it has a mind like mine.
Right.
And perhaps another way to think about it, which it sounds like is harmonious with the way that you're thinking about it, is more like there's something there and it's alive, and too much speculation on that. Maybe too much speculation. Yeah. And this is.
I like how that developed. So there's multiple levels that you can describe that experience at. One of them is the theoretical level, where you're trying to create a system that explains how this relates to everything else in the universe. Then there's the level of that stone just talked to me.
Yeah.
The level at which it is experienced.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
More immediate, more practical, more experiential, more
more undifferentiated,
and also more transient. Right? It just happens and then it's gone.
That's right. I think, for example, of the great ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood. She wrote an amazing essay about being attacked by a giant saltwater crocodile in Queensland, and she called it On Being Prey. I recommend it. And she was on a canoe in a boat, and she wasn't consciously aware of anything being wrong, but in fact this crocodile was homing in on her, but she sort of felt that something might be, and then she glimpsed a big rock on a very small base, and she said, the rock screamed danger at me. I mean, that rock was trying to tell her something in that moment, and then a moment later, the crocodile appeared.
Yeah.
I mean, I think lots of people have these experiences, but they tend to either keep them private so they're not laughed at, because in the dominant mainstream discourse this is ridiculous. Scientific consensus is ridiculous. And secondly, they edit them out themselves.
Yeah.
You know.
I also think, this is kind of treating it from a this is from a computational perspective. This is one of the questions that the artificial intelligence people and the complexity theorists are asking is sort of what's the metaphysical status of information and things like that. And I was just thinking one day, and I was thinking about like the Grand Canyon in the United States, right?
Right. Colorado
Colorado River, carving out those banks. And this thought just jumped into my mind that the river is processing the information of erosion, right? So the river and the Grand Canyon is processing information. It's thinking. Now it might not be a very, let's say, complex form of thinking. It's not very similar to human thinking. It doesn't seem, right?
I think it's very complex, but it's not
very fair.
But it takes different.
There's a lot of data.
Do you know the work of Gregory Bates?
I don't. I don't. I know you mentioned him as one of your teachers.
So his first book in '73, I think, was called Steps to an Ecology of Mind, and his second book was called Mind and Nature: A Necessary Unity. And the reason, the thinking behind that, to overcompress unforgivably, is that mind and nature work the same way. So, of course, there's not a unity in the sense of them being the same thing, but there is a great deal of common ground in between how mind works, how we think, and how nature thinks, which is what you've just been talking about.
Yeah, and I like the thinks in air quotes, right? Because what is going on there? I do not know. I'm not really quite sure, but it does seem to be a fairly true statement to say that river is processing the information.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
And, it's just an interesting thing to think about, right? And
absolutely.
It ties into that whole idea of, okay, so how should we think about other things as being sentient? And it sounds like the answer is something like, something's going on there.
Yes.
And you should be listening.
Yeah, that's right. And you may never get to the bottom of it.
which would be a very harmonious idea in terms of what we've been talking about, open systems and so forth.
Exactly.
Right? Not thinking you know too much.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's see. I think here's a question that I would actually like to go into, and if you don't mind me reading this off, because I just want to get this right.
Sure.
This is a piece of Tolkien's thought that has not quite gelled for me yet. So roughly the way this works is that Tolkien's elves have the good magic.
Enchantment.
Enchantment, yes.
Or what he calls fairy.
What he calls fairy, yes.
Right. I'm glad you came back to this, because I want to pick that up.
Good. That's what the elves have, is the good magic, which is enchantment, which is fairy, which is also what he calls art.
Okay, sorry to quibble.
You go
That's
right
not
ahead.
what the elves
Quibble away.
have, it's what they are.
Very fair. Yeah, okay.
They embody it and practice it.
Yeah.
Okay, go on.
Quibble accepted. And then Sauron is the Lord of Magic and Machines.
Right.
And so he has the bat magic, right?
Yeah.
Domination, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So here's the that's the way that Tolkien's metaphysics, sort of the metaphysical and ethical framework of Middle Earth is set up.
You're positing them as kind of extremes, which is fair enough, I think.
Yeah. Let's say yes.
And notice that, just let me
go ahead.
add something to that. It's important to notice that Mordor is the only modern state in Middle Earth.
And Isengard, probably, but...
Isengard is a wannabe Mordor.
Yeah.
So Mordor is the sort of modernist state. Obviously, it encapsulates sort of pathological modernity. It has a huge economy, slave-based economy, Tolkien says.
Yeah.
It has a surveillance, intense surveillance society. It has a massive military complex, right? With a great deal of research invested in it, in the military side of things.
Yeah.
more bangs for your buck.
Quite a large network of international alliances. Like he's going all over the place
He
too.
also has a bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It's modernity. There's no other state in Middle Earth, no other region, no other polity, which is modern in that sense.
Yeah.
So Tolkien was making a very strong statement there.
Yeah.
Pathological modernity and magic are the same thing.
Pathological modernity and magic are the same thing.
Technoscience in particular, which is part of that
Yeah.
modernity, is our magic.
Okay.
Right? And
yes.
the elves are not, they're not exactly anti-modern.
No, they're not anti-modern. Modern is anti-them.
That's precisely.
Yeah, they're the originary thing, and it's modernity that's...
Because enchantment is a non-modern experience. There's nothing about... So this Val Plumwood, who I mentioned earlier, she said that the project of modernity, or the program of modernity, is the rational mastery of nature, including human nature, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's nothing like that with the elves or in fairy. Nobody has any interest in mastering anything except perhaps your craft or your art.
Yeah.
Can I throw in two thoughts there?
Yeah, go right ahead.
The thing that this seems to bring out that I find interesting is the second categorical imperative. Kant said that you should never treat a person as a means merely.
Right.
And so you can treat a person as a means, like in the sense of going through the checkout line at the grocery store. You're, in some sense, treating the teller as a means to check out your groceries and make a purchase.
Yeah.
But not merely. I mean,
No, that's right.
you should at least be interested in them as an individual.
Entirely. Yeah.
And it seems to be that in craftsmanship, there's a respect of nature and of limits.
And of materials,
Yes.
so-called.
Yes. So a carpenter is the analogy I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
The awareness of wood grain, the different properties of different woods, the ability to make decisions based off of the limitations, both positive and negative, of a particular type of wood.
Yeah.
And also not just of a particular type of wood, like the broad category, but like each individual piece.
Right.
And there seems to be, the more that you are invested in and aware of that craftsmanship, the more we have a visceral positive reaction to it.
Sure.
As opposed to just bandsawing it out and calling it done.
This is all Ruskin's territory, by the way.
I need to read some Ruskin.
I'll give you the reference later.
Thank you, I'd appreciate that.
Well, and I was thinking, when I was in Alf Siegert's class on Tolkien at the University of Utah,
right.
There's a phrase, and I'm trying to remember where we picked it out from, the thinginess of things.
I don't know where that comes from either, but I like
isn't
it.
Isn't it good? Right?
Right.
Well, and it's a way to maybe think about the sentience of material things.
Sure.
Right. Because even when you start saying sentience, I'm not even sure I'm comfortable with that terminology, because it's too
limiting.
Human,
yes,
almost.
It's too limiting.
It makes me think too much of human minds.
I agree.
But I like the thinginess of things.
So Val Plumwood said, sentience is not the way to go. The important thing is what she called active intentionality.
Active intention.
That the other, whoever or whatever it is, has intentions that it's trying to realize, goes back to Aristotle, of course, in a way. That organisms are trying to realize their telos, their end.
Yeah.
Like an oak tree is trying to be the perfect oak tree, et cetera, et cetera. He took Platonic archetypes and put them in the organism.
I'm imagining kind of the relationship of, say, a farmer, where, a farmer raises an animal or a plant with a specific, human purpose in mind, but also it seems to be that the ends might be compatible. Like you could give a good life to a chicken.
It depends a great deal on the farmer.
Yes. Yes,
some are just
much.
trying to impose their will.
Could be compatible.
And it's totally instrumentalized, and you get agribusiness. Or some farmers are trying to work with the properties of the crop.
Means merely versus as a means.
I think so. Yeah.
I think a chicken could be used as a means for Sunday dinner, whilst at the same time being used not as a means merely.
Well, while being enjoyed, for example, as a chicken.
Yeah.
A live chicken.
Yeah.
This is actually something that I noticed when we were in the Netherlands. We were visiting some of these open air parks.
Oh yeah.
That have the windmills and so forth. And the first one we visited, it shocked me. There were sheep and ducks running all over the place. and what I thought when I was looking at those ducks was I thought, you know what? I want to live in a place where I'm surrounded by ducks.
Oh, yeah.
I want to eat a couple of the ducks, but I do not want to eat all of them. I want there to be a lot of ducks that are just being ducks.
Ducks are great. They're great.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now look, let's go back to Sauron
and
the elves. Did you want to add a third complication there?
Yes. In fact, I might even want to add a fourth one.
Well,
I'm
let's
not sure,
start
but you
with
can
the
stop
third
me.
one.
Okay, yeah. So there's Sauron and the elves.
Right.
Sauron,
Right.
Lord of Magic and Machines.
Yep.
Art and enchantment for the elves.
Right.
Now this also keys into Tolkien uses a word for the elves too for that art and enchantment, I believe, which is subcreation, right? One
Yes.
of his seminal statements on the subject is that the object of what the elves do is art, not power.
That's right.
Subcreation, not domination and tyrannous reforming of creation.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So art is more or less cognate with subcreation.
Yeah, I think
And
so.
once we start talking about subcreation, okay, I'm glad that you're saying yes, because I'm making a few leaps here, and they're important to where I'm going. So. So once we start talking about subcreation, now we're not only on the elves' territory as craftsmen and workers, but also on the territory of Tolkien as an author, as a spinner of stories.
Sure.
Right, as a teller of tales.
Exactly.
Right, and this is a fundamental concern underlying the whole reason why he embarks on this project of writing The Lord of the Rings and these other works is the desire to create a secondary world.
Yes.
So what I would really like to understand better, I hope I'm phrasing this question right. I'm right, like at the limits of my knowledge. So here we go. I believe this is a quote from Tolkien, right? That the primal desire at the heart of fairy, at the heart of enchantment, the realization, independent of the conceiving mind of imagine wonder.
Yeah.
So do you mind? We might even want to reread it.
It's an amazing.
Well, that's what I want you to take apart because I'm not sure I'm quite understanding.
The heart of fairy. Give it to us again. At the heart of fairy.
The primal desire at the heart of fairy.
Right.
Is the realization,
independent of the conceiving mind of imagined wonder. Right.
Yes.
I have thought about this.
Okay. That's what I had hoped.
Initially, I want to say he gave a few different definitions of fairy.
Yeah.
This is only one of them.
Okay.
So another very important one, which was in a manuscript that didn't get published, is that the essence of enchantment I think he uses the word enchantment, but fairy and enchantment are exactly the same thing for him. Is a disinterested love of the other as other, whether animate or inanimate, he says. Okay? So let's keep that in mind too.
A disinterested love of the other as other. Okay.
Right? Okay. So let's keep that somewhere in mind as well. So to come back to realization of imagined wonder. I think there's an ambiguity in that phrase, which is a creative one, because by realization, I think he means what an artist does when the artist successfully pulls off a picture of, or an oral, a sound version of, or whatever the medium is the artist is using, of something you'd only ever imagined.
Okay.
Such that, wow, you're seeing it, or you're hearing it, or feeling it, or whatever. So there's that kind of realization. However, I think it's valid to say, to infer, that in our lives as we live them, not confined only to art, but it can happen that you experience somebody, let's say you meet somebody or whatever, and you had only ever dimly perhaps imagined somebody like this, and there they are. And it tips you straight into enchantment, an enchanted state. Because some people, including some Tolkien scholars, have tried to say, oh, Tolkien only thought enchantment was only appropriate for art and artists.
That's exactly where I wanted to go.
And other people have said this too, non-Tolkien people. I think it's complete nonsense. In your life, when you fall in love with somebody, are you not enchanted? When you're blown away by a piece of music that you hear, yes, you're also enchanted. But is there any substantial difference between those two kinds of enchantment? I don't think so. You can even eat an amazing meal, local ingredients, beautifully cooked with love, with people that you love. This is an enchanting situation. Okay? So either you stretch art to include all life, which I think is a mistake because it makes the term meaningless.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
want to restrict art to some things and not some
Secondary
other
world.
things. Right. Or you have to admit that enchantment is a property of life, lived life, including art, but not only art.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you so much. That is exactly where I wanted to go, because that was sort of the ambiguity is Tolkien, when he's creating this legendarium, he's trying to create a secondary world, right? A world of
Right.
fantasy is the way we will describe
Sure.
it, right? A not historically true world, right? Not
Yes, not-
in terms of
Not literally historically
Yes.
true, but then that's complicated by the fact that literally historically is not so simple. That historians, when they
And that's a very fair point,
recount
too.
history, they are selecting, editing, they're joining things together, that and they're making connections that wouldn't have occurred to the people
Yeah.
at the time,
Yes.
et cetera.
For sure, for sure.
And also, where's the material for this secondary world coming from? It can only come from the primary world. It can't come from anywhere else,
yeah.
right?
And yeah, so this is exactly where I wanted to go, because this is a concern for our channel too. So the way it's framed with Tolkien, and then I'll frame it kind of the way we think about it on our channel, is as far as Tolkien is concerned, it's that fantasy literature and Tolkien can be accused of being escapist,
Oh.
right? Which that argument, the way that argument is constructed,
Infuriating.
basically,
Yeah. Well, you know what Tolkien said? They're confusing the escape of the prisoner,
yeah,
the flight of the prisoner, with the deserter.
yeah,
In other words, why shouldn't you try and escape?
Yeah.
Why shouldn't you try and
Yeah.
dream of things outside the walls of modernism?
Yeah.
Right. And what really upsets the people who use the charge escapism is that you're deserting the cause.
yeah,
The cause of
yeah.
modernity.
That it's frivolous. That you're not, kind
You're
of
a traitor, in
yeah.
fact.
You're not
Yeah.
sort of putting your shoulder to the wheel on that project.
Yeah,
when you should.
and then he goes on to say, what critic of the Third Reich could
Yeah.
not have had this applied to them?
Yeah, it's not a valid criticism in and of itself.
it's
So,
invidious.
so that's the argument, is that it will be escapist. That okay, so Mr. Tolkien, that's great. You're making your secondary world. It's very nice. We can go to the movie theater for a couple of hours and watch it, and that's nice. We can read the book for a couple of hours, and that's nice. But it has nothing to do with the primary world.
Yeah.
That's the way the argument would be constructed, right? And so I'm really glad that we're hitting this, because this is exactly the question, which is, okay, all of this art and sub-creation, how does it tie back to the primary world? What is the common link between, I think the two examples you gave were entering a world of enchantment when you're listening to music, and then entering a world of enchantment when you're in love.
Yeah.
Right, one primary, one secondary.
Right.
One art, as we normally think of art, as in a created thing, artifice. And then the other is part of reality, quote unquote.
Well, okay, I've thought of about 5 different possible answers to that question since you raised it, and
Okay.
I can't remember them all.
Oh,
As soon
no.
as I think of a new one, the old one drops off the end. So rather arbitrarily, let me say, my view of enchantment, one aspect of enchantment, is that it is not psychological. It's not a mental state.
Would you say not psychological or not merely
No,
psychological?
okay, I stand corrected. Not merely psychological, because the world is always involved.
Yeah.
Enchantment is not this cloudy, mystical, ineffable, indistinct. No, it's always very
Grounded.
and concrete and precise, right? It involves the world as much as it does the mind or the self.
The primary world, not just imagination.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Now, the question was, what was your question? Remind me.
What the unification point is, what the common term is between sort of enchantment and a secondary world when you enter
Right,
a novel
okay,
or a
yeah.
piece of art, and
So
enchantment in the
one-
primary world where
Thank
it's a
you.
quote unquote real life
Yeah,
experience.
so thank you.
Yeah.
So since it involves the world, what enchantment does, one thing it does is it actually shows you a deep truth about the world.
Okay.
So William James has this story, which he says, okay, Jack loves Jill. Everybody else looks at Jill, they see a perfectly ordinary person. Jack does not. Who's right? He says, Jack's right. He has access to a truth about Jill that nobody else does. And because he's enchanted by it, by her. Okay? It reveals truths, deep truths about the world, about what is enchanting you. So you take those truths into your life. So when somebody is enchanted by the Lord of the Rings, let's say, let's look at the extraordinary reality and value of the natural world
Yeah.
as Middle Earth, and its forests and its trees and its mountains and so on,
Mm-hmm.
in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a biggie for me. Okay. That had a huge impact on how I regarded and felt about so-called real forests,
Yeah.
mountains, trees, and so on.
Yeah.
So, where's the escapism there? This goes back to what a wonderful phrase called radical nostalgia that I pinched from an English writer called Fraser Harrison, who says, there's some kinds of nostalgia that are debilitating,
Mm-hmm.
but there's other kinds that are actually empowering.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was researching my book, Defending Middle-earth, 20 years ago, I found people in all kinds of environmental activism who knew much more about Tolkien than I did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were living it.
Yeah.
So I don't see this escapism. I just don't see it.
And so there's a clear example of how an experience in a secondary world
That's right.
affects your perception of and interaction with the primary world,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Reminds me of the G.K. Chesterton quote that rivers in fairy tales run with wine, to remind us for one wild moment that rivers actually run with water.
Well, that's brilliant,
Right.
isn't it? Yeah,
Um,
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So I'm curious then. So, what if you approach the problem from the other angle? One of the questions that we deal with on our channel is, roughly speaking, this is a rough paraphrase of what I think we both think, and Joseph can correct me when I misspeak for him. But is that we're deeply grateful to the Industrial Revolution for a great many things.
Mm-hmm.
Start the list and go down, right? Starting with penicillin and moving on from there. And yet,
Exactly.
something seems to have gone wrong somewhere,
Yeah.
right? So, and this is all of our questions about like appropriate technology and so on and so forth,
Exactly.
and finding the right scale of production and so
That's
on
right.
and so forth.
It's a peculiar idea that you're not allowed to criticize the thing at all.
Yeah.
Doesn't that reveal some kind of fundamental insecurity about it?
If you want to know who rules the world, look for who you can't criticize.
Exactly.
Well,
I think that's a quote from Mark Twain. I can't remember.
All right. Right.
Well, so kind of the question then is, okay, so you can kind of approach the problem from the other side and say, okay, I've entered this secondary world of art, like Lord of the Rings, or a piece of art or a song that has enchanted me.
Right.
And then I can move those insights back into the primary world, and I can remember that when I walk through the forest, I'm actually maybe walking through something like Fangorn.
Exactly.
What if you approach the problem from the other side? I'm thinking of, when I sort of walk through my ordinary life, I'm not always thinking, oh, this reminds me of something in Lord of the Rings,
No,
right?
of course not.
So when I'm sort of encountering, I hope this question makes sense. It may not, and if not, then I'll try to clarify. But I'm driving down the street in London, or I'm walking down the street in London, or I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing. I'm making my smoothie in the morning. What's the right way to look at those tasks? Maybe even those technological tasks. I'm repairing my car. I'm changing the oil in my car. What's the right way to look at those tasks, mundane, technological, whatever they are, that can, if not invoke enchantment, because it's not something you can make come.
No.
But what's the right way to approach those tasks so that you can at least invite enchantment, or at least leave the door open to it? Do you have thoughts about that kind of?
Leave the door open is a biggie for me. That's,
Okay.
As a phrase. That's because I think that's. I won't say that's all you can do, but it's a very important part of what we can do in relation to enchantment.
If I could
and
just
I'll
add
come
one
back-
thing to that.
Yeah,
So
cool.
to invite, perhaps, to leave the door open, and then maybe a third term is to not shut the door on it after it starts to come in, because that seems to be something too that.
Yeah, my third term is
Okay.
so what
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
invite, to leave the door open. That's the basic thing.
Okay.
That's why it's important.
Yeah.
To invite is an extension of leaving the door open.
Yeah.
The third thing is work with.
Okay.
You can work with enchantment.
Okay.
And to answer, and to return to your question about when you're doing these tasks,
Yeah.
they're not necessarily enchanted or enchanting.
Mm-hmm.
If there's relationship, if you're working with, if there's cooperation or negotiation, all those are forms of relationship. There's always the potentiality of enchantment.
Okay.
But if you foreclose on that, then enchantment has to break the door down, and it's usually not interested in doing that.
It's the ents. when it does finally break the door down, it's the Ents
Yeah.
sacking Isengard.
Yeah, could be.
It's not nice.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
That's the point when you've been ignoring the world outside you way too long.
But see, there's something you haven't asked me
Okay.
that is
go ahead,
important
go ahead,
in this
go ahead.
context,
Yeah.
which is the hobbits.
Okay.
Where do
Yes.
the hobbits fit into this? I think that the important thing to notice is, it sounds very basic, but people forget it. We're not elves.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be elves, some of us. We want to live forever. We want to be beautiful people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're not. So one implication of the fact that we're humans, not elves, is we cannot live in fairy. Or to put that another way, we cannot be enchanted 24/7. If you're enchanted 24/7, you're probably, as they used to say, away with the fairies. Not in a good way.
Yeah.
Okay?
It's a.
So the best we can hope for is to find ourselves in fairy from time to time, to visit, or for it to visit us,
Mhm.
and then we have to let it go. And very often we can't let it go, so it leaves us. We can't leave it, it leaves us. When they're leaving Lothlorien, the
Yeah.
Company of the Rings, their experience of leaving Lothlorien is not that their boats are moving, it's their experience
Yeah.
is that Lothlorien is withdrawing from them.
Yeah.
Because it's too gorgeous.
Yeah.
I can't let go. Okay, it's going to let go of you.
Yeah.
So we need to be able to handle that.
Which, if you don't mind me interjecting, that
Sure.
seems to be, that just mirrors a lot of my own experiences with, let's say, sacred or transcendent things that
Yeah,
even if I linger there,
right.
it doesn't linger.
That's right, exactly. That's right.
I end
yeah.
up just standing there like, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I'm physically here. I'm standing in the same location, but
I've had that experience
it's
too.
gone.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So,
Or,
sorry.
or I had that experience very dramatically in Point Reyes National Seashore in California, where my first time there was total enchantment. So a few years later, I thought, oh, I'm going to go back. And I thought, I must get some more of that.
Mhm.
Boy, did that not work out. It was not
Yeah.
going to play.
You can't make it come. And
In the
if you
same
if you
place,
could
what's the problem?
if you could make it come, it would be because you're Sauron.
Well,
It would be because you're.
That's right.
You know, it would be because it is not an independently existing thing. It would be something.
Well, that's right.
It would be a slave or an object. It would be something.
Which
It would be a piece
incidentally-
of property totally under your control.
Which also has very direct implications for the use of drugs. If somebody is using a drug in order to achieve a certain state of mind,
Mm-hmm.
a desired state of mind, get high or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that's magic. It's not enchantment. But Aldous Huxley's experiment with mescaline in 1959 or whenever it was, The Doors of Perception, classic full-blown enchantment. Because he wasn't trying to achieve anything. He wasn't even trying to get high. He was taking it just in order to find out what would happen.
Mm-hmm.
Innocent.
It makes me think. I don't know if it's on fairy stories or where, but Tolkien has this description of fairy stories, as he says, it's not about fairies. It's not about elves.
No, it's about the state or realm where fairies have their being and where we have our being when we're enchanted.
Yeah.
But the point is, we can't always be there.
It's about us journeying through
So
their land.
that's why the hobbits are so important, because to me it seems that the hobbits are the best we as humans
Yeah.
can aspire to. We can aspire to be hobbits. And hobbits keep the door open.
One thing that I like about them, I'm thinking in, metaphorical terms, they're little. They invite a certain form
They're
of humility.
The unimportant people.
They invite that humility
Apparently,
which
yeah.
leaves you sufficiently open to
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're into food. They do crafts.
simple.
They like to go for long walks
Mm-hmm.
in woods, preferably not too threatening woods, but they're still
But maybe a few of those too.
Yeah, exactly.
They do make you late for dinner, but
So hobbits, for me, sort of incarnate the principle of keeping the door open.
Hmm.
And that's what we should aspire to, not full-blown, permanent, crazy, transcendental Wagnerian enchantment.
It reminds me of a quote from C.S. Lewis where he talks about creeping past the dragons of self-consciousness,
Oh, does he?
where
That's
if you
nice.
are, it's a fantastic metaphor. But if you're self-consciously trying to achieve a certain
Oh,
state,
yeah.
it will always escape you.
It's not a good start.
No. And then you're starting to try to control yourself, and Freud tells us you can't do that.
Yeah. But
You
I
don't
do
even
think
know
it
what you
follows from what we're
are.
talking about that to have a healthy relationship with enchantment.
Yeah.
Doesn't you don't have to have a weak ego for that. In fact, a weak ego is a recipe for disaster. You have to have a very strong ego. Who you have to be able to say, okay, here I am back in the gray. What did Tolkien say? The gray and leafless world of disenchantment, of ordinary daily disenchantment, and say, okay, that's all right. I can handle this. Because then you're not grasping, you're not needing, you're not addicted to the enchantment, which is what poisons it.
Interesting.
You know? And incidentally, Gollum, a study in addiction. I mean, Tolkien's a single most important character, I think, in terms of his contribution to 20th century literature is Gollum.
Really?
Yeah,
That's a very strong contention.
He is a study in addiction. Only instead of addicted to a drug, he's addicted to the ring of power. And he wants it, he craves it, and he's terribly afraid of it. Which goes back to what I was saying about the Ring Wraiths, because it's the same phenomenon. Right?
Yeah.
He's a wonderful study in addiction. Who else has come up with anyone like Gollum? There aren't any others, I don't think, not that I know of. Anyway.
You know, you're good. I'm just thinking about those hobbits as the example of it. So, how do you think that approach? How do you think if I think we'll wrap up on this if you have a few thoughts on it? Is
sure.
How do you think all these ideas should inform our approach to technology? And the reason why I ask it is because, as we've talked about this, one of the questions that you run into or at least that we've run into as we've thought about this is, okay, but even art and let's say permissible forms of machines, right? Because even the hobbits have some small
intermediate technology. They have windmills.
Yeah. Even those permissible forms of machines, they clearly seem to influence the world, right? And so sometimes it's difficult to tease out the difference between those and the dominating machines of Sauron and Saruman.
The mega machine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
very difficult.
I'm curious what you think. As we approach these questions of how to use technology and how to approach those tasks. And perhaps general rules can't be given.
I was just going to say,
enchantment is very particular. It's very particular.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I don't think that question about technology can be answered in the abstract. I think it has to be case by case. It's
something like
given a piece of technology, is it possible to use this? You see, you can't really use technology without being used by it. So at the same time, but is in this particular case, this particular kind of technology, either is it possible to use it without being completely used by it, or perhaps more to the point, how can I use it? How can I handle it without being taken over by it? And obviously, that's a big issue in relation to social media and internet and cyberspace and so on. And then I think you have to evolve your own strategies together with other people on limiting use. Self-restraint is really tough.
I like the way that you describe that as evolving, because in a sense, what that calls for, that highly particular idea of when technology is good or bad, requires you to keep your eyes open.
Yeah.
Similar
case
to
by case.
Keeping yourself open for the divine or for enchantment.
Exactly.
You have to keep your eyes open with an eye toward what is good and bad, moment by moment by moment.
That's right. Yeah, I don't
particularly in things that are powerful, like technology.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think there's an a priori answer to that.
So, well, ironically, this winds us back to where we started in some sense, that even the answer to that question has to be answered at a small, local, particular level, individual by individual, moment by moment.
That's right.
Okay, all right. So. Well, we just tried to sneak past these requirements of enchantment, and nope, the gates are barred, and I'm glad they're barred.
Okay.
I'm glad they're barred.
Good.
So,
Good.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being on with us,
Yes.
Dr. Curry.
Very well.
This has been a rare privilege, not only to be able to put some of these ideas out to a wide audience, but also, in my own case, to sort of try to push these ideas a little bit further and try to see where they go and how they can be applied. So
Sure.
this has been a rare privilege for us, and thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Is there anywhere that that our listeners can find your essays, your books, and other works if they're interested in learning more about what you've written and said?
Well, I have a website which is easy to find if you do a search, and I will put in a tiny plug for my forthcoming book on enchantment, which is being published by Florist Books based in Edinburgh next October, this coming October.
Yeah.
It's going to actually, in my mind, my intention is for it to be the first of 3 books on enchantment. The second will be on enchantment and art,
Okay.
and the third will be the insanely long, baggy monster that I started out with that nobody would publish.
3 books, you're really spoiling us.
But
So-
the first one is at least it's short, so
Okay.
I'm happy about that.
And the title of that book is?
Enchantment, Wonder in Modern Life.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
I
right,
hope,
well-
I hope you enjoy it if you find it.
I'll certainly be looking for it, and I hope that lots of our viewers find it helpful too. So,
Thank you very much.
once again, thank you.
Welcome.